Hello everybody, and welcome to #Active4Life, our quality physical education show, where we get a better understanding of education in movement, education about movement, and education through movement. I'm your host, Norman Mpake, and together we're going to learn about the importance of physical education, but most importantly, we're going to have fun. We will talk about all things physical education and everything else in between. And we'll get to do some activities with you, which you can do on your own, or with your classmates, or with your friends. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of today's lesson, I think it's important for us to go through the next statement, which reads, "It is important to appreciate that everyone has different abilities, qualities that make them unique." Now, what we're trying to highlight here is you need to appreciate that all of us are different in one way or the other. And what we're trying to explain with this is to make sure that you do not ignore some of the differences that exist in learners. So the following statement to support that, it says, all learners are different in some way or another and have different learning needs. See, we have different learning needs which should be equally valued and understood as an ordinary part of our human experience. Now, to put this into context, let's put it this way. In your class, however many you are in class, some of the learners are the same age as you. You do realize some learners are taller than you, some learners are shorter than you, some learners are faster than you. Some learners are able to do things in a better way or not as good as you do them. But this is part of the fact that each one of us is different. And we need to appreciate and relate to the fact that there are certain learners who have special educational needs that also need to be accommodated, respected, understood, and appreciated. And that they too want to experience a holistic education experience. So I think you have a sense of what today we're going to talk about. Always remember that even though we have different abilities, both physically and intellectually, we are all more alike than different. And that's a very important statement that I want you to remember, that we are more alike than different, and that those differences are all part of being part of the human race. Now, just like everybody else, we all want people to understand and respect us. And today's lesson is about understanding and respecting those that we may consider to be different from us. So I suspect that now we are clear that what we are going to talk about today is about inclusion in physical education or adapted physical education. But before we get into details about that, let us ask simple questions. Would you like it if your classmates did not want to play with you just because you looked different or were unable to do certain things? I think not. And therefore, it would be expected that we all expect everybody to appreciate us for who we are, what we can do, what we cannot do, and that we should be able to find ways to work along with people living with disabilities as much as we work with all other people. So today's lesson is going to focus on those particular aspects about inclusion in physical education or what is called adapted physical education. So let's get into a minor definition. What is inclusion? Well, inclusion is about recognizing and respecting the differences among all of us and building on the similarities. Now, isn't that beautiful? That in as much as we recognize and respect the differences, it is important that we build on the similarities. And that is the significance of having to talk about inclusion in the context of how do we find ways to build on the similarities, but how do we make sure that we respect those differences that exist and not pretend that they don't exist. So it is of no use for you to try and pretend that the person living with disability does not exist, or to pretend that you don't see their disability and then not include them and pretend it's for other reasons. So find ways to be inclusive, to engage all learners especially those living with disabilities, and make sure that you find a way to accommodate and adapt the activities, adapt the way you behave around them, but make sure that you respect the way you do it and that it's not done out of pity, but out of respect. So those are the things that we're going to touch on. And so when we speak about inclusion in physical education, means that learners with disabilities participate in all activities equally with other learners. So it's a matter of having to understand that it is not a separate type of physical education, but it is that they're going to participate in the same lessons as you participate in. The difference is that the activities may be modified or adapted, and learners with disabilities learn the same concepts, the same skills, the same content as other learners in the class. So what we're trying to highlight here is, in an adapted physical education class where there's inclusion around physical education, it might be that certain components of activities have to be modified or adjusted or adapted to suit the particular needs of those learners with special educational needs. And that adaptation is to ensure that they have a full experience of the lesson, that they experience the same kind of content, but at a pace, a level, an intensity, and a complexity that suits their particular needs, but that they are not excluded. It cannot be that every time you do activities that you then decide that the learner with a disability must sit out, because we spoke about it in the previous lesson about universal access, that at all times all learners must be given an opportunity to participate, to do their best and be their best. And that can only be done by creating conditions and an environment that is inclusive. So when we speak about inclusion in physical education, we're talking about how do we make sure that learners, teachers, and everybody involved in that child or your life is going to make sure that you never experience any form of exclusion just because of your ability, disability, or any other differentiators. And it's important that we start having to have a conversation about how do we find the solutions. And it could be as simple as a conversation of trying to find out what can we do to make sure that we include everybody. We can have a conversation with the learner with the disability, or the learner with the disability can have a conversation with the teacher or their learners or their classmates. And it's a matter of making sure that it's done respectfully, but in a manner that allows us to find solutions and focus on the similarities and the objectives rather than the disabilities. And that is the importance of today, is that we're going to try and talk about those things. Now, which disabilities are we talking about? Now, this is not an exhaustive list. This is not all the disabilities that we find. We just identified those that probably cover a wide spectrum of things that we could be talking about when we talk about the disabilities. So right now we're just going to just do a list of those disabilities, and then we'll try to get into detail about how do we make sure that we adapt the lessons, how do we as learners participate fairly, equally, and understand that not all disabilities are the same, that not all learners with disabilities expect the same type of treatment or support, but that we need to be able to be aware of how wide the spectrum of disability exists. So let's just go through a few of the disabilities. As I said, this is not all the disabilities that they are, and I think at times it is important just to get a sense of what we're talking about. So here's a list. So generally, we talk about the autism spectrum of diseases. There's communication disorders, there are hearing impairments, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, and visual impairments. Now, ironically, is that at times some of these disabilities are not evident. They are not easy to perceive, to see, to know that they exist. And it is important for us to be aware that sometimes we may have to actually inquire or ask in order to understand. And I'm sure your teachers as professionals will be able to track and to see if some of your classmates are struggling with certain areas of the curriculum or in general, and they'd be able to pick up, and there are processes that are in place. What we expect is that each learner must be treated with respect in all situations, and so therefore not all disabilities, similar to physical disabilities and visual disabilities that are probably the most prominent and perceptible, that you will be able to see that this learner is in a wheelchair, this learner uses crutches, this learner has a walking stick and cannot see and is blind. Those are the easy ones to understand and to see, but it is important to understand that there's a wide array of disabilities that exist out there. And while we're talking about those particular disabilities, it's also important to note that there are certain things called rare diseases. And those rare diseases often are coupled with the type of disabilities that you find and have an impact on the learning experiences, the living experiences of the learners. And we need to be able to respect and find ways to accommodate those and understand that sometimes learners struggle with their day-to-day activities or educational experiences, and we need to find ways to be supportive. We need to find ways to find mechanisms and make sure that the environment, the classroom, the play area are suitable for them. And you'll find it's actually something that is quite rewarding for the learner with a disability and for learners without disabilities. And I think all of us should find ways to learn, to understand, and be inclusive, not because we have to, but because we also want to, and it is just a natural thing to do. We'll go through all other things after the break, and I think for this part we just wanted to introduce you to the concept of inclusion in physical education or adapted physical education, and draw attention to some of the disabilities that could classify some of the disabilities you will find in your school. But we'll go into further details about other things right after the break. Welcome back. Before the break, we had given you a list of the different types of disabilities that we may be able to experience or see in other learners. So for now, we're just going to go through the list of the 7 categories and try to give just a summary of those types of disabilities, just for you to be able to understand and appreciate the different disabilities. These ones that we had classified were autism, communication disorders, hearing impairments, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, and visual impairments. Now, we're just going to go through just those summaries as I indicated, just for you to have a better understanding and an appreciation of the different disabilities. So our list of definitions or descriptions of disabilities, we got it from a book called Disability Awareness Activity Packet, which was developed by Bev Adcock and Michael Remus. And so we're just going to take the samples from that book. I found it to be a bit more easy to read and a bit more accessible in order to try and define the things for this type of lesson, so that a wide spectrum of people could be able to understand the different disabilities. So the first one, which being autism. Now it stipulates that autism is a developmental disability that usually appears during the first 3 years of life. The cause is unknown. It affects how a person's brain works, but not all people with autism are affected the same way. And remember, we had actually spoken about how you may be the same age as somebody else, you may be from the same cultural grouping as somebody, you may have the same color hair as somebody else, but that does not mean you are the same as them. Everybody's different, even though we are similar in a lot of ways. So even in the autism, the differences or how people are affected by the disability is always going to be different. And here there's a person, when a person has autism, they may have problems letting you know what they want, what they're thinking, understanding what other people say or want, ignoring sounds, ignoring things or people that are moving, ignoring lights, being touched, understanding social rules, showing affection, controlling their feelings, knowing how to play with other kids, and dealing with changes. So these may manifest in a person with autism, but again, it's important to know that not all those manifestations are present in any person with autism. So again, autism is a spectrum disorder. What this means is that not everyone with autism has all the problems. One person may have 3 of the problems listed, while another person may have only 1. Some people with autism struggle to learn. Other people with autism are very smart and can do complicated math when they are 3 years old. Some people with autism have trouble being touched, while others like to hug. So this could be just about any one of us, and so therefore it just shows the diversity within this particular disability, and that you cannot just box a person as to say, because they have autism, these are the types of traits that you're going to find. As it states, it's a spectrum disorder, and you may find that some people manifest differently. And I want you to just appreciate those things and understand. Please note, if you need to understand further about this, please inquire more, ask your teacher, ask your parents, read more about it, and engage more and try to learn and understand these types of disabilities. The next one is communication disorders. Communication disorders are disabilities that keep a person from being able to speak or make their speech understood. So it's either they are unable to speak or their speech cannot be understood. This can be caused by many different disabilities or injuries. Remember earlier on I said sometimes we may even speak about the rare diseases. That some diseases, some rare diseases actually may lead or cause some disabilities in people. And so this is another example of how different disabilities and injuries may cause communication disorders. Some people with difficulty speaking may use sign language, gestures, or small pictures they carry with them. And I think it's one of those things that I'm sure you've seen people using sign language trying to communicate, and it's because of that communication disorder. And so you need to be able to understand and appreciate that you may have to make an effort to try and accommodate their inability to communicate. The next one was hearing impairments. It states that hearing impairments include everything from not being able to hear certain sounds to being totally deaf. In most cases, a hearing loss doesn't simply mean that sounds are not loud enough. It usually means that sounds are unclear. A hearing aid may make a speech louder, but usually will not make the speech clearer. So again, if you see somebody with a hearing aid, do not assume because they have a hearing aid that they'll be able to hear you clearly. It might be that it's actually assisting them to make the sound louder so that they can hear that there is a sound that's taking place and that they can discern what's going on around them. So as again, the hearing impairments, there are variations in how people experience their hearing impairments. The next one, there are many different kinds of learning disabilities. And I'm sure that we've all experienced or seen examples of this. And then a common one within the education space is dyslexia, where a person with dyslexia can see letters switched around. So instead of being able to see them in the order that they're written, they're slightly muddled up. And so that's one of the disabilities, the learning disabilities that was listed within the book that explains what dyslexia is, and so that you are able to at least understand. But the gravity, the magnitude, the different types of learning disabilities exist, they're classified, and the teachers would be able to identify when learners have learning disabilities and should find ways to either support or find referrals for those children to be able to be assisted with those learning disabilities. When a person has an intellectual disability, it means that they learn slower. Because they learn more slowly, they don't learn as much as other people or other learners might be able to learn. And that not everyone with an intellectual disability is alike. One person can have mild problems, while others have severe problems. Again, this is the same scenario as with all other disabilities, is that not all disabilities or disabilities cannot be boxed into certain traits, into certain behavioral patterns. and so we need to be able to understand the magnitude and diversity and respond to the needs of all learners living with those disabilities. And all learners need as much support as possible, and so we all need to find a way to work together. And then we go into the physical disabilities. Remember I said some disabilities similar to physical disabilities are those that are easily perceivable. You can be able to see it and be able to discern. But it's also not to assume that you understand the type of disability that the person is experiencing or living with. There are a large variety of different physical disabilities, all of which can range from mild problem to complete immobility. You know that you might find learners in your class or in your school who are using a wheelchair and they're able to move their own wheelchair. And there are learners who may need assistance. And the difference in the disability is something that you need to pay attention to. Many people will have more than one disability, such as not being able to use their legs or hands. And as I said, you might find some learners are not able to use either of their limbs or any of their limbs. And so there's different classifications for those particular disabilities, which again, as I said, if you need to understand, we can just go into more details, or you read about it or ask about it. Then there's vision impairments. Now, vision impairments include things like being short-sighted and far-sighted. So for people like me, if I do this, I cannot see anything beyond a meter. So you can imagine the things that happen around me beyond a meter. And so that's a visual impairment. And other people are far-sighted and that are correctable with glasses, as I explained in my own case, that I can only see for a certain distance. After that, everything becomes blurry. All I see are colors. And so it can also mean that more serious problems like blindness or problems that are only helped by a little by glasses. So there are certain people with certain conditions that predispose them to having visual impairments. And we might assume this is probably the most common impairment that people have, and it's corrected by glasses. But as I said, those differences that we see in people sometimes, if we start appreciating and understanding them, we may learn to live around them and make sure that we respect those people with those particular disabilities. So, so that's for the visual impairments. So going back into the physical education lesson, I think what is important that we wanted to highlight in these particular things is that, as we said earlier on in the other episode about universal access, by having appropriate activities, is the fact that even when you come across your classmates who live with those disabilities, it's important that you intentionally and purposefully pursue making sure that they are included in everything that you do, that you do not ignore them, you don't isolate them, you don't leave them out of activities, and that all physical education lessons should always be accessible and inclusive for learners with a range of different disabilities. Now, there's the word, all physical education lessons should always be accessible and inclusive. So even if you are being inclusive in how you teach, it should be accessible. There's no point in saying that your lessons are inclusive because your teacher has made sure that there are stations, but if the learners are unable to access those lessons, if there's no ramps in your school that allow children with wheelchairs to be able to access the facilities, or the equipment has not been modified sufficiently to cater for their particular needs, it really doesn't help to say that you are inclusive, but you make it inaccessible for learners to do that. So the range of cognitive, intellectual, and other developmental disabilities, mobility, visual, hearing, and mental health disabilities. We've spoken about these things. We've just given simple examples of all these particular disabilities. But what we're trying to say and consistently say, inclusion in physical education is similar to inclusion in all educational experiences, inclusion in broader society. Our constitution requires us to be inclusive and accommodate all needs of the people, and especially in physical education. Let us be aware, let us be a bit more inclusive, and find ways to accommodate each other. I mean, as I've stated, I know what my disability is, or my impairment, and I would appreciate that some people do take care that when we are engaging in certain physical activities, that there are certain things I'm unable to do because I cannot do them with my glasses on. Lessons should address individual needs of participants with disabilities through accommodation or adaptation that are necessary or specifically tailored for those needs. Remember, accommodation and adaptation. It is the onus is on the teacher and the classmates or the school to make those adaptations. You cannot expect the person with a disability to now try adapt to the requirements of the activity. So it's important that those adaptations and accommodations are made in due time, and then they're not just random adaptations, but it's important that it's done right. And so just in closing, we've just included some tips on proper language and etiquette when interacting with a person with a disability. So for example, you replace the disabled with people with disability. You replace the words like autistic with a person with autism. You, instead of saying crippled, handicapped, or the disabled, say person with a disability or a person who uses a wheelchair, whichever one is, because they are living with that disability, they are not the disability. Then do not assume a person with a disability needs help. Ask first, then listen to any instructions. Ask first, then listen to any instructions the person gives about the best way to assist them. Even then, do not be offended if you offer for help, your offer for help is not accepted. I think it's actually quite an appreciative space there, that sometimes you may ask somebody if they need help and they say, no, I'm okay, I can do it myself. Don't feel rejected. They genuinely don't want to be assisted, just like you. Sometimes somebody asks to help you and you say, I'm fine, and therefore in the same context. When talking to a person with a disability, speak directly to them, not to their companion or caretaker. Speak to them. That's, if you want to address them, unless otherwise you find that you might need to be guided accordingly. Be patient. Allow people extra time it may take for them to say or do something. But this is the same context with everybody else. We respond differently to different circumstances. We respond differently to different activities. Some of you take longer to acquire a particular skill, learn a particular thing, and so therefore please be appreciative. But for me, most importantly, relax and be yourself. That's all we can ask. Be respectful, relax, and be yourself. You don't have to try to behave in a way that is different in order to think that you are accommodating the next person. Just be respectful, be yourself, and engage in a respectful and a relaxed manner. I hope that we've done justice to this topic about inclusion in physical education or adapted physical education. And I hope that we will all be able to understand, respect, and create an enabling, inclusive, and accessible environment when we engage with all learners, irrespective of their age, their gender, their disability, their ability, their orientation, their likings, their dislikings, that we can find ways to be inclusive by intent and not inclusive because we are told to be inclusive. And so that will be all for today. I hope you did appreciate today's lesson. I know it was a bit wordy, but it is important that we give time to understand things that we sometimes don't give recognition to and talk about openly, even when we have limitations in understanding them. So ask more, read more, and be more inclusive. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, please send us a WhatsApp to our WhatsApp line, and we'll do our best to respond in due time. Thank you very much.